Much more frequently. It could be as many as 2 or 3 times, sure.
Okay. And you talked to the jury about testing that you did. I just want to make sure that they're clear that the testing that you performed does not tell us whether or not the defendant suffered from psychosis on the bridge.
100% correct.
Okay. But that testing that you did was to determine if he was exhibiting symptoms of psychosis during your evaluation.
Some of the tests, not all of the tests.
Right. But specifically the malingering for psychosis testing was to determine his state at the time of your evaluation.
Correct.
Okay.
Whether he was exaggerating or fabricating when we met,
right.
Not what he was telling me about back then. You're right.
Right. There's no test you can give him to determine if he was suffering from psychosis or not on the bridge.
No test goes back in time. Correct.
Right. Okay. Now, there was one test that you gave him, and Ms. Manuel asked you about it, and that test showed some inconsistencies. That was the PAI, correct?
Personality Assessment Inventory.
All right. And in that test, he was asked to talk about depression, right?
Among other things.
Past symptoms of mental illness.
More like current symptoms of mental illness, but things like whether you've used drugs and alcohol in the past,
right.
Whether you've gotten in trouble with the law in the past.
And did you give him the PAI first, or did you give him the other test first?
I don't remember. I'd have to go to my notes.
Could you do that and let us know? I'd just like to know the sequence.
Yeah. Just gonna pull it out. It's a lot of notes, sorry.
Take your time.
My first contact with him, I didn't give him either of those tests.
Okay.
Okay, so remember, I met with him 3 times. So that's the notes from the first meeting. I gave him the PAI first, and then I gave him the structured interview of reported symptoms.
Okay. And the PAI, the first test you gave him, indicated there were some problems the very first time you took that test, correct?
Insofar, the inconsistent responding to similar items.
Right. And you said one explanation could be cognitive problems?
It could be impaired attention and concentration. That's one explanation.
But I don't think that you found that that was, in terms of cognitive problems, the reason why he had issues with that test, correct?
Well, his explanation was, I was pretty upset and distressed, by all that we had talked about.
Right. So cognitive problems has been ruled out, correct?
Cognitive, like memory problems or
yes.
Limited reading ability?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And the other explanation could have been Christmas treating it like a test where you don't care about the answers.
Randomers, who cares?
But you don't think that that's what was going on here because he was taking this seriously.
He said not, and you would expect a different overall profile if he was responding randomly.
And I understand that you gave the explanation that he provided, but another option is he could have been faking his symptoms on that test, correct? That's a possibility.
Possible, but I think there's good reason to think not.
Right, but it's a possibility. You have to admit that.
It's possible, but the rest of the test doesn't suggest that. But it's possible, yeah, sure.
And when you gave it to him the second time, he did better, correct?
He answered in a more consistent way, but there was still a little inconsistency in terms of his responding when you compare him to most people who take the test.
And you would agree that when someone is answering inconsistently on a test, that there is always a concern that someone could be trying to make themselves look better on the test, or in this case, look more mentally ill.
You're worried about it if they're not. That's a possibility, right? That's why there's other scales to look at.
You did not administer a PCLR test in this case, correct?
I did not.
You do not know if this defendant suffers from psychopathy, correct?
I read. No.
It's a possibility.
Possible.
All right. Now, at the time of his arrest, he indicated to you that he was supporting himself with Social Security disability, right?
Yes.
He also indicated that he was receiving Social Security benefits for Phoebe, correct?
That's what he said.
All right. And he was also receiving money from Michelle Kerr, the mother of Phoebe, correct?
Intermittently or inconsistently, so he said.
And as far as working, you would agree that his employment was very unstable, right?
I agree.
And in fact, when he was arrested, he had a Social Security letter in his pocket at the time of his arrest, correct?
Regarding Phoebe, I believe.
Right. And do you recall what that letter was about?
It was raising questions about her eligibility and whether funding would continue because of a lack of information being provided, I believe.
Right. And he actually was being directed in that letter to give an accounting for how the money had been spent, right?
I don't remember that specifically, but I don't dispute it.
All right. Now, you would agree that his lifestyle was very unstable during this time.
Moving from place to place, not a consistent residence, I agree.
And you would also agree that he had emotional and behavioral difficulties as a child? Right?
I agree.
Now, he was never in special education classes, correct?
He reported not.
All right. And Dr. Arthur is someone that you relied on in this case and his records?
I, in part, relied on those records.
Okay. You would agree that Dr. Arthur never diagnosed the defendant as having schizophrenia, correct?
He never did.
Never did, right? His diagnosis was bipolar 2, correct?
Correct.
Okay. He never diagnosed him as being psychotic, correct?
Well, I disagree.
Okay. How do you disagree?
Because well, first of all, psychosis is not a diagnosis, first. And secondly, he documents symptoms of psychosis in the notes.
There was one. That was the skin bubbling issue that he said he was experiencing.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's the only time that he diagnosed this or observed this defendant as having any type of psychotic symptom.
That is the one psychotic symptom I remember. Whether there were more in the notes, I just couldn't say.
Okay. Well, that was the only one. And you don't dispute that at this point, correct?
I'm saying
Go ahead.
I'm saying I don't. There are maybe 15 pages of notes. I remember that symptom in particular. Whether there were other symptoms of psychosis in those 15 pages, I cannot tell you. So I can't say there were, nor can I say that there weren't. So I'm really not. I'm not disputing what you're telling me. I'm just saying I have no memory.
That's fine.
I have no memory to dispute you.
You're not disputing it. And if there were other references, I would think you would probably remember, right?
Well, no, I don't agree with that, but there could certainly be references and symptoms that I might not remember, given my memory.
There were no other indications in his notes about the defendant having auditory hallucinations, correct?
Again, I don't remember.
Don't remember. All right. You would agree that at the end of 2014, the defendant reported his heaviest drug use, correct?
Yes.
All right. I want to talk about personality disorders for a second. You mentioned that you actually diagnosed him with a personality disorder, right?
I did.
And what is that diagnosis?
Other specified personality disorder with borderline and antisocial features or traits.
And what does that mean?
It means that, in my opinion, he doesn't meet all the criteria for any of the specific personality disorders that are well established and agreed upon by consensus. However, there are clearly features of certain personality disorders that he displays, in my opinion, that I think are noteworthy and remarkable.
And you do believe he has a personality disorder, right?
This particular one that's sort of an amalgam or combination.
Okay. So it's not like he doesn't reach the level of having a personality disorder. He actually has one.
Sure, just not kind of consensually agreed to ones.
What are some of the defining characteristics of the personality disorder that you've diagnosed him with?
So it's other specified personality disorder could be a whole range of things, but I narrowed it to borderline and antisocial features.
And what is that? What does borderline mean?
Borderline features are things like having very difficult and problematic and stormy interpersonal relationships. That would be a trait or a characteristic of someone with borderline features or borderline personality disorder. Having poorly controlled emotions, right? That you don't do a very good job of controlling your emotions. Seeing things in black and white terms. Someone's either wonderful or they're terrible. And people in your life, you'll go back and forth in terms of your opinions of them. So it's a very unstable and a very troubling way of interacting with people. And that's the borderline piece.
And that's something that is his personality, correct?
In my opinion.
Right. And that's separate from your diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, correct?
That's correct.
And the term borderline features, the term borderline comes from borderline personality disorder, correct?
Right. That's an agreed upon consensual definition.
And there's nothing in the term borderline that means you're close to having a disorder. The term borderline defines that personality disorder.
Oh, yes. Nothing like almost or close. No, absolutely right.
Right. And you also said antisocial features. What do you mean by that?
Yes. Well, antisocial features are behaviors typically characterized by things like not meeting your responsibilities, taking advantage of other people, not following rules, breaking the law.
And based on your opinion, the defendant meets those features, correct?
He has some of those features.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, and that's features. Yes. You didn't ask about borderline. I'm sorry. You didn't ask about antisocial personality disorder.
No.
Right.
We're talking about the antisocial features.
Features. Yeah.
But there's enough of these features that he actually meets a personality disorder, in your opinion.
He does. In my opinion, he doesn't meet. I could have said antisocial personality disorder. I didn't. But I acknowledged that there's some behaviors he's displayed, some features, some traits he has that are antisocial in nature that are worth mentioning here.
But they rise to the level of a disorder.
When you put them all together, yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as antisocial personality disorder, the reason you did not diagnose him with that is, in your opinion, you did not see a conduct problem in his childhood years, correct?
Right.
If you were given evidence of a conduct disorder in his childhood years, that would change your opinion, correct?
Yes.
And if you were provided that evidence, then you might likely find that he does have antisocial personality disorder, correct?
Quite possibly, yeah.
All right. Does the defendant have aggressive behavior? Is that part of your disorder?
Yes.
one of the things that are components of this personality disorder, aggressive behavior, does that factor into that disorder?
I'm sorry, which personality disorder?
The personality disorder that you diagnosed him with.
You don't have to be aggressive to get that diagnosis, but if you are aggressive, that's sort of a tick. That sort of is a check on the. It can be a criterion, but you don't have to be aggressive to get it.
Did you find in your analysis of the defendant's past that he does have and has demonstrated aggressive behavior?
I think I really keyed on the domestic violence, which he acknowledged as. He took some responsibility for the domestic violence, and he also attributed some of it to his ex-significant other, Ms. Kerr. So, but yeah, there was violence, yeah.
Let me talk to you about Dr. Mackless for a moment. You disagree with Dr. Mackless that the defendant is not bipolar, correct?
Correct.
And as far as his opinion that the defendant is bipolar, your opinion of schizoaffective disorder is a complete and distinct diagnosis to that, correct?
They're different diagnoses.
Right. In your report that you wrote, you would agree with me that you did not make any reference to the fact that the defendant threatened his mother on January 5th, just a few days before the murder?
I don't know if I knew that.
Does that change your opinion at all?
No.
Not at all?
No.
The statement that the defendant gave to Melody Dishman some time ago, in which he told her that if he ever got in trouble, he would claim insanity, is also not in your report, correct?
Correct.
You knew about that statement at the time that you wrote your report, correct?
Yes. I referenced it in my report.
And you would agree that on January 6th, when the defendant is with Genevieve Torres, the day before the murder, that he's goal-directed in terms of what he wants?
Yes, she described him as fully coherent and showing no problems and raising no concerns. I heard her testimony.
Right. And his behavior with her that day was logical, right?
Certainly. She clearly made that crystal clear, I think.
On January 7th, the next day, he told her that it won't matter anymore. You recall that statement?
Yes.
And then later on, when he's with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's deputies, he explains that statement. Do you recall that?
That's my memory.
Right, and he tells them that he's confident his attorney is going to get him the outcome that he wants, correct?
That's my memory of what he told them, yes.
So when he is confronted by a statement that could indicate premeditation of the murder, he has a logical answer for what he was thinking at the time, correct?
So the assumption is that by saying none of this matters, that's premeditation of the intent to murder.
That it could be, yes.
Could be. And then so by him saying, I'm confident that I will prevail.
Right.
That's evidence of that he's attempting to hide his premeditation deliberation.
Well, what I'm saying is when he explains that statement, his explanation was logical. That's my point, right? He makes this response, it's not going to matter anymore because I have a good lawyer who's going to help me with my case.
Yeah, that's potentially logical. Sure, yeah.
You testified
I'm just saying you could interpret it's not going to matter anymore as I'm doomed for failure. In which case saying, hey, I'm super confident, cops, this is all going to work out because I have a killer lawyer. It could just as well be that. But I don't dispute that your possible interpretation, sure.
Now, when he drove south, you testified that he was driving south because he had this delusion of an ice age coming, right?
So he said.
But when he went over the Skyway, he took 75 up north, correct?
Yes.
So that would be a contradiction in terms of the delusion, right?
He's not going south.
He's not going south. And he told you both he and Phoebe were possessed by demons, right?
Yes.
And he said both he and Phoebe had to die in order to save the world, right?
Yes.
But yet he didn't jump, correct?
That's right.
So the delusion was so strong, he had to kill his child, right?
I didn't say he had to kill his child.
Well, isn't that the delusion?
That he had to kill his child. I never said that Mr. Jonchuck had to kill his child.
I'm not suggesting you did, but I'm saying the delusion that he reported to you was so strong, he had to kill his child.
That was a delusion. He had to kill his child to prevent the world from coming to an end. And he had to die too.
And he had to die too.
Right.
So the argument is he followed that delusion because it was so overwhelming and overpowering that it made him do something he wouldn't otherwise do. Is that accurate?
I don't know if I'm saying his volition was impaired, right? That he was overcome, that he couldn't, I don't think I've ever testified that he couldn't control himself. What I'm saying is that he told me that it was his belief that he had to kill his daughter in order to save the world, and indeed he did so.
Right.
He killed his daughter.
And it's your testimony that the delusion is what drove him to do it, right?
What caused him to do it.
Right. And we're assuming he wouldn't normally kill his child.
Correct.
So that delusion had to be so strong that it forced him to do something or compelled him to do something he wouldn't normally do. That's what you're saying.
Led him to do something, right.
But yet the other part of that delusion is that he had to die too.
Right.
And he didn't.
That's right.
In your opinion, he knew what he had done, correct?
He intended to kill Phoebe.
He knew the consequences of his actions. He didn't know the wrongfulness, in your opinion, but he knew the consequences.
He knew that I think he reasonably believed that if he put her off the side of the bridge, she would die.
Right. And that's your opinion as to his thought process at the time that this happened,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. I hope I never suggested that I believe that Mr. Jonchuck thought I can put her over the side of the bridge and everything will be lovely, or, she won't die. I didn't mean to give that impression.
Because that's not what he reported to you.
That's right.
Right. And you agree that there was some evidence that he did appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions, right?
Some evidence, potential evidence, yeah.
The fact that he fled from law enforcement.
He either fled from law enforcement or he continued on his journey. Right, one of the two.
Well, in your opinion, there was some evidence that he wasn't just continuing along his journey, right? That he was actually fleeing.
I guess I have to say yes to that. Yeah.
Okay. And in fact, that evidence made you write in your report that this is kind of a complicated matter. And in fact, that led you to write in your report that this is complicated.
Yes.
You agree with that, right?
Yes.
It's not that easy. Going back to personality disorder, I think you previously testified that personality disorder does not cause psychosis. Is that correct?
I want to say yes, but I think it's misleading just because personality disorder doesn't cause psychosis any more than diabetes causes skin cancer. It's apples and oranges. Personality disorder is a category of mental disorder. Psychosis or psychoses is a category of mental disorder.
You would agree that personality disorders do drive someone's thinking, right?
Oh, sure. In fact, whether you give a particular personality disorder diagnosis is in part based on how they think and what they think. You're absolutely right.
It drives their feelings, right?
And how they manage their emotions and the emotions they experience, right.
And behavior as well, right?
And what they do, right.
Previously, I think it was yesterday, you were discussing different types of impairment, and you'd reference people who are homeless. Do you recall that?
People who are homeless with mental illness,
right.
Not everyone who's homeless.
Right. As far as this defendant is concerned, prior to the killing of Phoebe, there was no other incident where the defendant was observed to be grossly psychotic, like he was in jail after the murder, correct?
I will say this. I think he was more impaired in jail than he'd ever been in the past. But I think he was psychotic, whether it was gross or not. He was certainly psychotic before he killed Phoebe and before those events. But I agree with you. He was more impaired in jail than he'd ever been at any point in his time, at least that was ever documented.
When he's on top of the bridge and Officer Vickers has his gun drawn on him, is it possible that this could have been an attempt on his part to commit suicide by cop?
Possible. Probably could have done more to get killed. Attack the officer after he dropped Phoebe off the side of the bridge or something like that. But yeah, it's possible. I guess leaving the officer who you want to kill you probably is a little inconsistent with hoping the officer will kill you.
But it's a possibility. You would agree with that?
Sure.
You previously testified that the meeting with Attorney Torres on January 7th was unscheduled?
He told me scheduled. I subsequently learned it was unscheduled.
If you learned that he called before he arrived, does that make it scheduled?
I guess it was scheduled in his opinion, but Ms. Torres' description was that it was unscheduled until Mr. Jonchuck announced his intent to meet. By way of the message, she had no intent to meet. That's all I meant.
You read that email, and you brought out the fact that there was some punctuation missing.
I read a few emails, yes.
But you would agree, just because there's punctuation missing in an email doesn't necessarily indicate someone is psychotic just by reading the email.
It could be a sloppy writer or doesn't know grammar, yeah.
Right, and you would agree that this defendant didn't graduate from high school, he dropped out, and then later got his GED.
Yeah, that's true, but I mean, to be fair about this, he showed perfect grammar in his August email, right? I mean, that was perfect. He demonstrated a knowledge of punctuation, good grammar, finishing one thought, moving on to the other, and I think it stands in stark comparison and contrast to the latter email that was sent, that we're referencing.
But you're not suggesting that just because he missed some punctuation marks that automatically means he's psychotic?
No, it's not just the punctuation marks. It was the kind of moving from topic to topic and making assumptions that Ms. Torres might be knowledgeable about things that she likely wasn't knowledgeable about. That too.
Well, he was referencing his paternity case, though, correct?
Oh, he was talking about the case that she knew about, for sure.
Right. Can I moment, Your Honor? That's all I have.
Dr. Otto, I'm giving you a copy of Dr. Arthur's records again to look through. I've tabbed a couple portions there. I think the state asked you about if there was only one reference to a psychotic symptom. I think was their question. Mm-hmm. Is paranoid thinking, can that be a psychotic symptom?
Paranoia can be psychotic. It can reflect psychosis. Paranoid delusions reflect psychotic thinking, impaired thought content. We talked about that a lot.
Does Dr. Arthur make multiple notes about Mr. Jonchuck being paranoid or paranoid thinking?
Okay, well.
Take your time.
Looking at the pages you flagged, that's probably a good place to start.
Probably.
On one session, he describes Mr. Jonchuck as getting somewhat paranoid. On another session, he describes Mr. Jonchuck as making up paranoid scenarios. That's a quote. There were the somatic hallucinations that the prosecutor and I agreed on.
What is a somatic hallucination?
So somatic is bodily. So it's a very unusual kind of hallucination. So you might think that bugs are crawling on your body. This particular hallucination, as described by Dr. Arthur, was that his skin was bubbling.
And when was that? I'm sorry.
That's what he reported. His report to Dr. Arthur led Dr. Arthur to write somatic hallucinations, skin bubbling, and then there's a word I just can't read.
And when was that note?
November 2nd of 2012. There's another note where Dr. Arthur describes the defendant as paranoid, feeling very paranoid and making up scenarios. So now, I can go through the rest of all these notes.
That's okay.
But I agree that the possibility of other psychotic symptoms are suggested by descriptions of the defendant as feeling paranoid, but sometimes healthcare professionals use words in ways they shouldn't be used. So I'm making an inference based on the words, based on Dr. Arthur's notes.
And did Dr. Arthur prescribe Seroquel?
Yes.
And Abilify?
Yes.
And we talked about what Seroquel was already. What is Abilify typically prescribed for?
Abilify, off the top of my head, I don't remember.
Okay.
Sorry.
The state had mentioned that you are paid for your time, $200 an hour. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. Now, if you were sitting in the audience and watching other people testify all day, would you be getting paid for that time?
If I was hired to do that. Well, if I was hired to do it, I would get paid, yes.
Okay. So if an expert hired by the state were sitting through trial...
Objection to approach.
Yes. ...3 days of the trial in the audience to watch, would you be expected to be paid for your time?
Yes.
Were you asked to come sit through anything other than your testimony?
I've never been asked to sit through anything other than I've never been asked to sit through a trial. I've never been asked to sit through a trial, nor was I asked to do that here. I will acknowledge that at one point you did ask me to review the video recording of a particular witness who testified. That was Ms. Torres after she testified. So I did do that, but that was in my office or at home, I believe.
Gotcha.
It was up online.
All right. Did the state ask you if you diagnosed Mr. Jonchuck with psychopathy? Is psychopathy a DSM diagnosis?
No.
Mr. Jonchuck was receiving, you indicate was receiving benefits, Social Security benefits, in part for Phoebe, right?
On behalf of her and himself, right?
And,
my understanding.
And that's what I was going to ask. He was receiving them for his own conditions as well, correct?
Right. He reported for psychiatric impairment in combination with problems related to an injured back. Dr. Arthur's notes, I think, essentially corroborated his report of disability benefits, at least in part, for the psychiatric impairment.
Why did you not, the state asked you that you did not administer the checklist, the PCLR?
Mm-hmm.
Well, first off, is the PCLR a test or a checklist?
It's an assessment tool. I don't describe it as a test. That's not to diminish it, but I describe it as an assessment tool.
It stands for checklist, right? Psychopathy checklist revised?
That's what it stands for, PCLR.
Gotcha. And why did you not administer that?
I don't think it's really relevant in cases when you're assessing someone's mental state at the time of the offense.
Is there research that suggests that position?
Objection. It's hearsay.
Is there research that suggests that
There's
position?
been 2 studies that I located that were done, looking at the frequency with which that tool is used and how helpful it is considered to be. I found 2 pieces of research that indicate that it's rarely used and not considered to be providing particularly relevant information.
Regarding somebody's mental state at the time of offense?
Yeah, in
Right.
the sanity context, right.
Okay.
Other applications, yeah.
So did you administer tests that you thought were actually relevant to your determination?
Right, they're the ones I administered.
Do you think that John killed his daughter because of a personality disorder?
No.
The state asked you specifically if your diagnosis differed from Dr. Macklis's diagnosis of bipolar disorder.
They did.
If you were provided information that Dr. Macklis has indicated his current diagnosis would be schizoaffective, do you guys have the same diagnoses then?
I guess so.
The state asked you regarding the PAI, the personality testing that you did, if it was possible that John was intentionally trying to mislead you or mess up the test or something to that effect. And I think you started to answer that it was possible, but you had good reason to think not.
Yes.
Could you explain that?
So, test is 334 items, check off, and then those items end up going into various scales, okay? One scale is just devoted to indicating to you how consistently someone answered the items that were similar in content. And that's the scale that was elevated. He answered items of similar content inconsistently. Red flag, what's going on? There's other scales that are designed to identify people exaggerating and fabricating problems. Oh, I'm terribly impaired. I need help. Give me money. Don't prosecute me. Those scales weren't elevated. Those scales weren't elevated. Yeah, he answered inconsistently, but he didn't endorse the item suggesting faking bad, malingering. So is it possible that the inconsistency scale was elevated because he was exaggerating and fabricating? I guess it's possible, but I conclude otherwise because the scales that do get elevated when you are faking and faking bad and malingering, they weren't elevated. Nor were the scales where someone's saying, hey, I'm great, I'm healthy, I got it all together. We got scales to identify people faking good or denying problems as well. They weren't elevated either.
There was a random statement provided, if I ever get in trouble, I'm claiming insanity. Did you give that much weight?
No.
Why?
Just because I think people say all kinds of things. Just because I think people say all kinds of things. Mr. Jonchuck denied it. He said he didn't say it. Someone said he said it. At the time I initially considered it, I didn't know how old he was when he said it.
Okay.
So I would say I discount that statement, and I'll tell you why. Because people say all kinds of things, and people say all kinds of things when they're 12 that might not reflect how they think and what they do when they're in their 20s.
The state also asked you about whether the statement, none of this is going to matter tomorrow, could be or possibly be evidence of premeditation. Did you observe evidence that was inconsistent with premeditation, with the premeditated killing of Phoebe?
Well, what I would say is I thought that if he left his house with the idea of killing Phoebe, he did it in a very clumsy way, insofar as he engaged in a string of behaviors that really drew attention to himself. And if you were thinking clearly and you're not impaired by symptoms of severe and persistent mental illness, in my opinion, that's not how you go about doing it. That's my rational, that's my logic there and my thinking about it.
Well, would it make sense that he was...
Let me say this. I'm sorry.
No?
I also think it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Non-responsive.
I also think it doesn't make a lot of sense if you're intending on killing your daughter later in the day to act in such a way that you draw the attention of organized law enforcement, to get your attorney to breach attorney-client privilege and call the cops on you when you know the police are fully capable of hauling you in for involuntary examination, what most people refer to as a Baker Act, right? I don't think it works to your advantage if your goal is to kill if the goal is to kill your daughter, to draw all kinds of attention by behaving in ways that get people that arguably might get people concerned, putting salt under the doors and claiming Bibles are knocking and your daughter's chanting and she's possessed and you're the Pope and all of that. As I interpret that, I think that's inconsistent with someone who is planning to kill his daughter and move on.
Well, what would you say that there was, I guess, so it's premeditated and then he just throws in these things to claim insanity. Does that make sense?
Okay, well...
Again, it's leading, Your Honor.
So, all right, I'm going to kill my daughter and I'm going to lay this trail of breadcrumbs to get the insanity defense. That may have started then in 2011 and 2013 when he was treated for significant impairments by Dr. Arthur. So that, I don't think, in fact, 2011, I don't believe Phoebe was alive at that point in time. But the history of psychiatric symptoms long predates these events.
May I have a moment, Judge? That's all I have. Thank you, Doctor.
Anything further, Mr. Bowman?
Just very briefly, Your Honor. Okay. So, Doctor, there was one somatic hallucination. We know that now.
In the record.
In the record with Dr. Arthur, just the one. You don't know if there was drug activity that was involved to
He
precipitate
might have been
that?
using, that could have been caused by drug use, yes.
Right. And I'd like to show you another record. Coach, what? You would agree in this record by Dr. Arthur, specifically letter F, he's asked to report whether or not there are any hallucinations, delusions. He says none reported.
Yeah, I think this is the intake form, right? So that's, I mean, it would appear to be inconsistent with later reporting the somatic hallucinations that are in the record, but I think that's just because that form was filled out before the record that we were just referencing. But I agree they're inconsistent, but that's because that was completed before this, I believe. The somatic hallucination note.
That's your opinion that this is an intake form?
I think I mean,
It mentions
I have a factual basis for that.
It mentions an adjudicator at the top.
It's not an intake form. You're
It's not
right.
an intake form.
No,
correct?
it was a claim, some kind of claim.
Right.
Yeah.
For benefits like disability benefits, correct?
Right.
Right. And Dr. Arthur noted none reported on this section for hallucinations and perceptual disturbances, correct?
And just now I'm confused because
Do you need me to approach this again?
maybe because what I have
Can I
here
approach
doesn't have all pieces of the form. Maybe your copy does. That's page 2. No, page 3. Yeah. So it's the second. It's apparently one of 3 pages.
Right.
Yeah, that apparently was completed at some point in time. It's undated, referencing no hallucinations. Right.
You would agree that when he's asked to write whether or not there was any history of delusions, unrealistic thinking, he writes negative.
Right. I agree with that.
But there's self-confidence and self-esteem issues is what he writes, correct?
Yes.
Right. And you would agree that Dr. Arthur's primary treatment of this defendant was related to his mood, correct?
I think that's accurate. His mood. Yeah.
Right. And you would agree that Seroquel, which is a drug Ms. Manuel just asked you that Dr. Arthur prescribed, is a drug that's also used to treat mood disorders.
Mood and other kinds of impairments. Right. I agree.
And nowhere in the records from Dr. Arthur does Dr. Arthur ever use the word psychotic or psychosis, correct?
I don't remember ever seeing those words.
All right. And you would agree that psychopathy, while it may not be a DSM diagnosis, is a real clinical term, correct?
It's a real clinical phenomenon. It's a real thing.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't doubt that that is a real thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. And in fact,
I agree.
You agree, right? And you would agree that psychopathy is the most extreme form of antisocial personality disorder, or a variant of antisocial personality disorder.
They have some similarities, yes.
Right. And you, in fact, have administered a PCLR before in your career, haven't you?
Yeah, never in a case like this, but in other cases.
Let's approach, please.
So you answered yes, you've done it, correct?
Yes, I've administered in other contexts.
May I have a moment, Your Honor? That's all I have.
Anything further?
No,
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Otto? Okay, Ms. Ruska? Questions that the jurors have asked. If you're better at looking at it as opposed to me reading it, you can do that. Question, I don't know who this is from. Why is psychosis not a diagnosis? Whose question is that? Okay, Mr. Miranda.
Psychosis is mental illness is broad, and there's different categories of mental illness. So, for example, there's things called neurodevelopmental disorders, autism, intellectual disability, other kinds of impairments that we demonstrate typically when we're younger. That's one category. There's another category of disorders, mood disorders, bipolar disorder, manic depression, major depression. Okay? There's another category of disorders called psychotic spectrum disorders, or psychoses, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, psychotic disorder secondary to a traumatic brain injury. So think of it, I don't know, maybe think of it as the equivalent of, there's General Motors, and then we have Chevy, and we have Cadillac, and we have Pontiac. We have mental disorders, we have psychoses, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, psychotic disorder secondary to traumatic brain injury. So I'm not saying that if you're psychotic, you're not mentally ill. I'm just saying that that's not a specific mental illness. That's the distinction.
Did that answer your question, Mr. Miranda?
Yes.
Okay. The next one is from Ms. Resto. When did John stop using drugs in 2014?
He reported anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks before. He inconsistently reported between 2 or 4 weeks before the end of the year.
Does that answer your question, Ms. Resto? Okay, this is another one from Ms. Resto. Could it be possible that the email with no punctuation could have been voice to text rather than him typing his email on a computer? You want to see it?
Yeah, that's. I'm not very sophisticated about this, I guess. Oh, I use it, but I'm not very sophisticated. Yeah, possibly. Yeah, good point.
The next question from Ms. Resto, could hallucinations, delusions, psychosis have been caused by the use of spice, crystal meth, or ecstasy in 2014?
In 2014, yes. Those drugs can cause those significant impairments, those significant symptoms, yes.
And then from Mr. Hoffman, in all the medical records made available to you from all sources, are there any x-rays, CT scans, MRIs, endocrine labs looking for organic defects, injuries, genetic malformations? Question. Want to see it?
Sure.
And then there's two others
And
after.
give me a little more time to think about it.
Okay.
There were labs done. Anytime you enter almost anytime you enter a hospital, there's going to be labs. Oftentimes when you enter jail, there's labs. I don't remember any labs that were remarkable or relevant to understanding Mr. Jonchuck and his psychological functioning. There were MRIs that I observed, but they were about his back injury, and they were positive for bulging discs and things like that, but I don't think that's what we're asking about here. I don't remember seeing any brain x-rays or CT scans or MRIs or PET scans. I don't remember none in the forensic hospital record, certainly none in the jail record. I didn't see any of that. Could these things be factors or causes of alleged mental illness of the defendant? I mean, possibly, but it was never identified by any of the treatment providers or examiners, those kinds of impairments. And then there was another question, Judge?
Yes, if you could read it and then answer.
Was an IQ test administered? I don't believe any person who's ever evaluated Mr. Jonchuck, whose work I've seen, or any treatment provider has ever administered an IQ test. So his IQ has never been formally assessed by way of a test. I didn't see such records.
Does that answer your questions, Ms. Thomas? Okay, thank you.
And I didn't, obviously.
Anybody else have any other questions for Dr. Otto? Yes? Okay, take your time.
I didn't write it down.
Yeah, you should write it. It's better practice. Thank you. Take your time. Thank you, Mr. Miranda.
There was one, that last response,
The IQ test?
no, the one before that. Could I say something?
Yes.
Yeah. It's quite possible that when he was twice admitted to the forensic hospital in Gainesville. It's quite possible that they did an MRI. That oftentimes occurs upon initial admission. If it occurred, I don't remember seeing it. the only way the IQ would affect his diagnosis is if his intellectual functioning was significantly compromised. No mental health professional who's ever examined or treated Mr. Jonchuck has raised the issue of intellectual disability, what we used to call mental retardation in the old days. So I suspect that no IQ tests were administered because no one ever had questions about whether his intellectual functioning was so impaired that it might be worthy of consideration. So if an IQ test was administered and he did terribly on the test, so terribly that he scored less than like 2 or 3% of the population, and along with that, he showed deficits in adaptive behaviors, ability to live independently, going back to his childhood, then we could add a diagnosis, intellectual disability. That's a mental disorder, that's a diagnosis. But I don't think Mr. Jonchuck has ever acted or functioned in a way that's ever made any mental health professional who's looked at him say, hey, I think he might be limited intellectually.
Thank you, Mr. Miranda. Does that answer your question? Go ahead.
One more thing.
Sure.
So the diagnosis, can it change if you have a higher, or like a superior IQ as opposed to somebody with a regular IQ or lower IQ?
Yeah, my opinion, and I don't think, I'd be very surprised if any other experts who testify in this trial offer a differing opinion. I'm not of the opinion that Mr. Jonchuck has limited intellectual abilities, intellectual deficits. If he was 130 IQ, the genius range, that wouldn't affect any of these other diagnoses. People who are brilliant, who are intellectually superior to the rest of us, they can have all these problems. They can abuse drugs, they can abuse alcohol, they can have problems with schizoaffective illness, they can have personality disorders. So high IQ, being brilliant, doesn't insulate you from any of the disorders that I or any other mental health professional has diagnosed Mr. Jonchuck as having.
Does that answer your question, Mr.
Yeah.
Miranda? Okay. The next question from Mr. Seawack is, so no one has ruled out organic brain damage?
Judge, I think we need the record corrected on the source of that question.
Yeah.
It's not me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, Mr. Hoffman, okay.
I guess I would say is no one's ruled it out by way of any of the tests that were referenced, to the best of my knowledge.
Mr. Hoffman, answer your question.
Is there any other way to rule it out?
Well, if you saw some kinds of deficits that you thought might reasonably be expected to result from what you refer to as organic brain damage, or if you had any reason to believe that there might have been a basis for organic brain damage, like, for example, a blow to the head, or maybe being exposed to drugs or something when you were in utero, or maybe eating lead paint when you were a kid or something like that. That's really the best I can give you.
Answer your question. You can write another one if you want to.
Sorry, I'll just leave it at that.
Pardon? Okay. Anybody else have any other questions of this witness? No? Stand by or excuse?
I have a couple caller questions.
Okay, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Dr. Otto, in the records you reviewed, did you see evidence that Mr. Jonchuck had been treated for seizures in the past?
Yeah, he has a seizure disorder that's well established, even dating to childhood. There was a seizure disorder.
And you had indicated that drugs can cause hallucinations. Illicit drugs can cause hallucinations.
Oh, certainly. Many.
Did you have any reason to believe that that's what caused Mr. Jonchuck's hallucinations in January of 2015?
Jack, will you approach?
Yes.
Did you observe any evidence to suggest that Mr. Jonchuck that his hallucinations were caused by drugs in January of 2015?
No.
You had mentioned some issues that you might expect to see if somebody was exposed to drugs while in utero.
I mentioned that could result in damage to your central nervous system.
Could that also contribute to childhood behavioral issues?
Certainly. If your mother is drinking a lot of alcohol or using a lot of drugs, you may be born prematurely. You may be born with intellectual limitations. Not a concern with Mr. Jonchuck. You can have problems with attention. You can have all kinds of emotional and behavioral and cognitive challenges if your mother is abusing drugs or alcohol while you're in her stomach.
May I have a moment, Judge?
Anything further from the state? I hear a ripping.
He raised this question for me.
Okay, no problem. Jurors are encouraged.
Entirely my fault.
Miranda, can seizures cause a person with Mr. Jonchuck's mental disorders kill his daughter at the time of the offense?
No, I don't think so. I don't think you attribute this to a seizure.
Does that answer your question? Did I hear something else that had a question? Yeah, go ahead, write it down, take your time. Self-reported he stopped using drugs a few weeks prior. Could potential withdrawal trigger symptoms during time of incident? Question? That's a question. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think withdrawal. I wouldn't think about withdrawing from those drugs as causing the symptoms or impairments he reported experiencing.
Does that answer your question? Anyone else have a question? No? Okay.
I do have one follow-up to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Otto, the timing for the drug use, did Mr. Jonchuck indicate that he had stopped using drugs sometime before, I guess 2 months before, but there was a relapse, there was a one-time relapse between 2 and 4 weeks?
In December of that year, correct.
Okay.
Anything further? Anybody have an additional question based on that question? Okay. Excused or standby?
We asked him to stand standby.
Okay, so Dr. Honor, you're on standby. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Judge, give me a picture. Till 4:15. Thank you very much.
Jury's out of the hearing in the court, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you.
All rise. Court will be in recess till 4:15 according to the courtroom clock.